The second topic I'd like to touch on today, Mr. President, is a subject that is apparently misunderstood, and it is certainly wildly mischaracterized. And it's the subject of rescissions. And it's become a topic of conversation as the President, the administration has proposed a rescission. And what a rescission is, it relates to our budget process. It is when money that was originally authorized by Congress to be spent on a program, but actually is not spent, that authorization is revoked. It's rescinded. But it's with respect to money that was never spent. Now, specifically, I want to discuss how this relates to the Children's Health Insurance Program, which is often referred to by the acronym CHIP, the CHIP program. So if you follow recent media reports and comments by some of our colleagues and even some industry stakeholders, boy, it sure seems like there's a lot of confusion. Let me state an unequivocal fact. Since 2011, there have been rescissions from CHIP every single year. This is not new. It's happened every single year since 2011. Now, is that because Congress decides during the course of each year that they don't really like the CHIP program, or they don't like children, or they don't want kids to get health insurance? No, that is not why it happens. The reason it happens each and every year, Mr. President, is because Congress systematically, intentionally, willfully authorizes far more money for the CHIP program than it's ever going to actually spend. We have a chart that illustrates this, and you can see the vertical columns, the red bars, show how much money Congress has authorized in the years to the left of the dotted line. Those are those are historical years. To the right of the dotted line is the projected future years. So the red bars are how much money Congress has authorized for the CHIP program. The green line shows how much of that money actually gets spent on the program. You can see that in each and every year, the red bar is way above the green line. Has been going back to 2009. It is every single year. And if we continue on our current path, that will continue to be the case, as you can see, going into the future. Now, take a particular year. For example, this year, 2018. We expect that the federal government is going to spend $16 billion on the program. Now, because of the nature of the way this program works and certain features, it's possible that we'll spend $16.01 billion. It's possible that it'll end up being $15.99 billion. But we know that $16 billion is enough to provide the federal share of funding for the children enrolled by their states. But as I say, we don't know it with precise precision right to the last dollar. So, knowing that it's going to be about $16 billion, how much money do you think Congress authorized for this program that's going to cost $16 billion? The answer is $25 billion. $25 billion. When we know for a fact, everybody, including our Democratic colleagues, know that we're not going to spend nearly, nothing close to that amount of money. And as I say, this overfunding, this is not unique to 2018. It happens each and every year, and it's going to continue well into the future. Now, within that $25 billion, I should point out a subset. There's something called the Child Enrollment Contingency Fund. Now, in 2018, $4.3 billion of the $25 billion is designated for this Child Enrollment Contingency Fund. And the word contingency is there because it's meant, theoretically, to be a backstop. In case the demand, the utilization, the demand for this program is so great that the allocated money isn't enough, there'll be this contingency fund. So that raises a question, Mr. President. Is that a sensible number, $4.3 billion? Well, let's look at this. Since 2009, there's been a total of $11.4 billion made available in this very category, this contingency fund. That's represented by the blue circle on the chart. How much has actually been needed? The answer is 100 million, 1/10 of 1 billion. That is 0.9% of the amount of money that's been made available has actually been used for this purpose. $11.4 billion authorized in the decade since this contingency fund was invented. Now, during that period of time, all 50 states and the District of Columbia, if they ever needed it, they would have been able to access this. Now, that 50 plus 1 over the course of 9 years, that's 460 opportunities for a state or the district to come to the federal government and say, hey, we need some of that money from the contingency fund. 460 times. How many times has it actually occurred over the course of those 9 years? The answer is 3. And the amount of money is less than 1% of what's been authorized. 108 million used out of $11 billion that's been authorized. Well, next year, according to state law, despite the fact that no state is even close to consuming the full amount of the main fund, we're going to allow another $4.5 billion to be deposited in this account when the sum total of all the states' usage for the last 9 years was $100 million, a tenth of $1 billion. So look at it another way. If you look at all the chip-related accounts, all the federal money that's been designated for this children's health program since 2009, Congress has willfully and systematically authorized so much in excess of what's needed that actually only 58% of the money has gone to the CHIP program. Because that's all the demand there was for this program. So this, obviously, Mr. President, raises a question. Why is it that year after year after year, Congress, including this year, Congress intentionally authorizes so much more funding than we're ever going to spend on this category, on this program, on the children's health program? Well, I will tell you why. It's a big budget gimmick. It creates a big opportunity for Congress to lie to the American people and spend more money on other programs under the guise of putting it towards the children's health program. How does this work? Every year, as I mentioned at the beginning of my comments, after knowingly authorizing way more money than is needed, Congress comes back and says, oh, you know what? Let's do a rescission. But we'll take this money out of CHIP and we'll spend it on something else. And it could be spent on anything else, whatever the politically favorite cause is of the moment. But buried somewhere in a 1,000-page appropriation bill every year, there's been a rescission, and the money has been shifted to something else. So basically, it becomes a slush fund to be used in the appropriation process and to allow the appropriations to exceed the cap on spending that we'd all agreed upon. So that's what happens, Mr. President. Congress willfully creates a number way above what we're going to spend, comes back a little later and says, oh my goodness, look at all this leftover money. Well, let's just take it and spend it somewhere else. It's completely dishonest. It completely misrepresents the CHIP program. It completely misrepresents, in fact, it blatantly violates the spending caps we've established, and it's not trivial. It's not a trivial amount of money. Over the last 8 years, the amount of these rescissions so that it can be spent elsewhere has added up to $45 billion taxpayer dollars. Entirely a gimmick, a device that just allows Congress to lie to the American people about what they're spending. So that brings us up to last week. The administration comes along and says they have a suggestion for Congress. First of all, let's fully fund the CHIP program. Let's make sure that that is fully funded. There will be no shortage whatsoever. But let's stop the lying. Let's remove the deception. Let's provide a reasonable amount of excess funding, because I acknowledged at the beginning we don't know right down to the last dollar exactly how much we're going to spend. But let's take aside all of this wild excess. And so let's be honest. Let's rescind now most of the excess funding, which has been going on each and every year separately. Let's leave more than enough in the contingency fund, even though it's extremely unlikely that any of it will be tapped. The administration has proposed $500 million to be left in the contingency fund. Remember, that's the fund that has been used to the tune of $108 million over the last 9 years. But they're saying, let's leave $500 million there. So 5 times as much has been spent cumulatively over the last 9 years. And basically take all the rest, all of this huge excessive amount, and send it back to the Treasury so that it's not just spent willy-nilly and irresponsibly. Now, for some reason, despite the fact that not a single dollar that would have actually been spent on the CHIP program will be spent differently, will not be spent, despite the fact that the CHIP program won't lose a single dollar of actual funding, despite the fact that Congress has been doing this every single year since 2011, as long as it can spend it on something else, despite the fact that 65 senators, including 40 of my Democratic colleagues, voted to rescind $6.8 billion from CHIP. How long ago? In March of this year, a few weeks ago, including $3.1 billion from the contingency fund. So the vast majority of my Democratic colleagues voted to rescind money from CHIP just earlier this year. Despite that, now we have people up in high dudgeon wailing and gnashing of the teeth about how what we're doing here would tear apart CHIP, which is what they did in March, by the way. That it's somehow a betrayal, they say. It's immoral, it's appalling. It hurts low and middle class families. Mr. President, it would be too generous to suggest that this is merely a lapse of memory here. Everybody knows what's going on. This is ridiculous. So I fully support the President's proposal that we fully fund CHIP, but stop with the dishonesty in our budgeting. Stop throwing a bunch of money under this category knowing that we're going to go back later and spend it somewhere else. This program shouldn't be pillaged this way to spend money on unrelated things that just allow us to bust the budget cap. But I'd go a step further, because what the administration has proposed, to their credit, fixes this terrible flaw this year. I would like us to permanently fix this, and I've suggested to my colleagues, rather than specifying a dollar amount, since we don't know the precise dollar amount, I'd be okay with a provision that says such sums as will be needed. Then that would guarantee it would be fully funded, but it would not create this big excess that gets wasted on who knows what. Now, if the only concern people had was to ensure that the CHIP program were fully and properly funded, how could you object to that? It would specify, codified in language, that that would be exactly what would happen. It'd be fully funded. But, well, we've gotten some resistance to that. How could that possibly be? Unless it is that people want to continue this gimmickry, this deception that's been going on for all these years. Well, I hope we will be able to work out a long-term solution. I hope we'll bring an end to this. I understand that my colleagues on the other side want to spend more money. Well, just admit it. Admit it, and let's debate it. But we've got an agreed-upon spending caps. I think they're too high, but that's what was agreed upon. We shouldn't be lying to the American people and going through this gimmick yet again. So I want to state my unequivocal support for the administration's proposal for a rescission package. I would prefer if there were actual spending being cut. This is indirectly going to help reduce excessive spending because it's going after these unobligated funds. It's going after these excessive accounts. It happens in other accounts, but CHIP is the most noteworthy. Mr. President, to me, this is a modest step in the direction of honest budgeting and protecting taxpayers. So I hope we'll be able to have a permanent solution to this soon, but in the meantime, I hope my colleagues will support the administration's rescission package, and I yield the floor.